here we are. We've got most people have kind of gathered. Some will probably still come in, but we're kind of past the kind of starting time. So kind of welcome to this 5th Cockburn Conversation, which forms part of the annual Doors Open Days Edinburgh's extravaganza, which of course is a major virtual event this year. But I think even more special for us is the fact it's the 30th year that the Cockburn has been involved in organising Doors Open Days. And at the very heart of the event, it's about allowing people to get in behind or into buildings that they usually wouldn't get a chance, or to get in behind the facade to hear the stories for which they never knew about. And that's actually the spirit of what these Cockburn Conversations are about this year. It's about exploring kind of Edinburgh's hidden and at times contested histories, so that we can all learn a little bit more about the heritage of this kind of city. And of course, we're absolutely kind of delighted that our online digital program is now available for you all to experience. Just go to cockernassociation.org.uk/Doors Open Days, and you'll find over 70 buildings that are participating in this year's event. And indeed, we're still adding new venues as we speak, which is driving us slightly crazy at the moment, but that's the nature of a digital event. It's going to be fantastic. We're using kind of Zoom and a webinar package. So for those attendees, just to be aware that your microphone and your video functions will be disabled during the duration of the event. But if you have a question, and please do, we want to hear your questions, you can either use the Q&A function or the chat function that's kind of in the bottom toolbar for you to kind of to use. We will hopefully be posting live on Facebook sometime soon. We're having a little bit of trouble with the kind of interface with Facebook at the moment, but bear with us. And if you are tweeting, then please use hashtag Cockburn Conversations, capital C and then capital C as well. And when you do, please remember, which is our decision, is to respect everybody in the views that they're all having to say. And if you do kind of enjoy tonight's conversation, or you've been with us for the week and are looking forward to the weekend, then do think about joining the Cockburn as a member, or perhaps leaving us a small donation. We've been able to bring this to you on an absolute shoestring, and everything that comes into us goes to help our purpose, which is about protecting the amenity of the city of Edinburgh's neighbourhood. Right, I've said too much kind of already. So the important thing now is to introduce our two conversationalists to you. First of all, leading the show is our chairman, Professor Cliff Hague. And our guest tonight is Sara Sheridan, the author of the book, Where Are the Women? A Guide to an Imagined Scotland. Over to you, Cliff.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome, Sara, and welcome everybody else, and thanks for joining us this evening. Sara has a number of strings to her bow. She's a very well-known author, and we're delighted to be able to dig into her historical research and literary skills tonight. She also runs a company of feminist perfumes called Reek. Unfortunately, the digital medium that we've got doesn't allow us to share the perfumes with you tonight, but we can share the many other skills that she's got. So Sara, you grew up in Edinburgh, and it's obviously from your books, it's influenced the way you look at things. Can you think how you experienced the city as a young girl growing up here? Anything that really made an impression on you?
I was a great walker. I mean, I suppose I was lucky in a way that it was the 70s when I was, the main part of my childhood and into the early 80s, and we just didn't look after kids in the same way. So we were just chucked out. My mother was like, get out there, go into town, and you'd be 8 on your way into town, or climbing a hill. It's a great one for climbing a hill. So I loved climbing Arthur's Seat, and I loved going up the Braids, and I loved going up Blackford Hill. And so, yeah, I had a real sense of the city. My father was an antiques dealer, but he was someone with a hugely broad interest in architecture and in jewellery and in artefacts, all different kinds of artefacts. And so you would walk round with him and he would say, do you see the way that stone's cut? They didn't have that, they didn't have a stone cutter that could do that until this particular date, and they can date these windows, and they've changed that roof a bit. He was quite interested in all that. So it was certainly something that was very much live to me as a kid, and that I feel incredibly grateful for now. And I suppose the thing I still love about Edinburgh is I've lived here for really most of my life, and I can still turn a corner and see a view that I haven't seen before. And it is that kind of endless sort of box that opens onto a box that opens onto a box. It's a city that works on so many different levels. So yeah, it's a fantastic place to have lived. That said, I am just about to move to Glasgow, which is a terrible thing to say on the Cockburn Association, but I think there's a lot of stuff I'll miss in Edinburgh, and the way that the city works on a totally different scale. You know, Glasgow's very much a grid system, and apart from the new town, Edinburgh doesn't really work like that. It's a lot more rambly, so I think I'm going to miss that actually.
Okay, so let's that's interesting. And yeah, do you think you would have written differently if you'd been brought up in a different city? Do you think it's actually influenced your writing?
Yeah, I think that's one of the really interesting things that I discovered. I mean, there's a lot of things I discovered when I was writing Where Are the Women, because when you're writing a novel, and I write two different sets of novels, so around about 1820 to 1845, all over the world. I've written a book set in the Arabian Peninsula, a book set in China. I've written a book set mostly in Brazil and in Chile. And so you delve into, you know, that 6 months, and you find out everything you possibly can, you know, what a housemaid earned and how long it took to get from York to Newcastle in a coach, and all the different things that you need to know in order to be able to write that one book for that 3 months or that 6 months of the setting of the book. But writing, and I also write in the 1950s, and again, it's just a year that you need to know about and what was going on in that year and what were the fashions and the music and the film, and you set your story kind of around that. So when I was writing Where Are the Women, suddenly here was this landscape that was, you know, all of history. I could include monuments, imagine monuments to any woman from history and even from folklore as well. And I started to look at history very, very differently. And one of the things that I discovered, or one of the things that actually I think is probably the most important thing, and I'll come to the thing that is the answer to your question next, was I suddenly realized that I was ceasing to view history as a set of dates about, you know, who was on the throne or who was prime minister, or, you know, what were these kind of large, big headline things. These didn't seem to be the things that were important to me. And I started to view the generations in relation to each other. The whole book is about women's history. So I was constantly thinking to myself, well, the suffragettes were like 4 mothers ago for me. I'm in my early 50s. Or the Jacobites, I think, ended up being 13 mothers ago. And so you had this sense of a mother holding her child's hand, and that child then becoming a mother and a grandmother, and everyone had held everybody else's hand in this chain of knowledge that was sort of passed down and passed along. And of course, people then had their own ideas or disagreed with their mother, but they came from a place that developed. And that was really, really interesting, because it's something that you sort of don't really get into in a novel, certainly not when your novel's set in, you know, 3 month or a 6 month period. It's something that sort of doesn't come up. And the other thing that was really interesting was being able to see how the built environment and the landscape influenced the history. So you would find these pockets of women. You'd find a pocket of women who worked in factories and wrote poetry, really good poetry actually, in the era in Dundee. And these working class women were not writing poetry really anywhere else in that era, in the 18th century. That is where that was happening. And it was because there was an educated population of fairly empowered women who were working in these factories, but also trying to make money on the side. And some of them didn't get married because they didn't want to be married, because they were the main wage earners. Women were earning more in Dundee in this period than men were earning. And they start writing poetry. Or you go to Edinburgh and you suddenly see you've got dramatists and opera singers, and that's part of the heritage. But in the same period, you've got music hall stars in Glasgow. And so it's the way that the sort of culture of these different places really affected what women who probably had a great deal in common, but what they went into, where they saw their opening, what was possible for them. And that was really interesting, because I hadn't realized before how important your political environment and your built environment actually are in terms of your opportunities. So that was a real eye-opener, because there were several of those kind of individual pockets that only happened once, and they happened because of a series of particular particular events or particular circumstances. So yeah, it was a really fascinating, though exhausting, book to write, because I actually wrote it in, I think, 8 months, which was it's a bit of a breeze.
That's fascinating. Yeah, the way that the built environment and the economic structure of a place intersects with other dimensions such as gender to shape the culture. And in the book, in the women book, you quote early on. You quote George Orwell, "Who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." And then you just say he, emphasizing that. But do you want to just tease that out a little bit, that phrase? Because it seems to me that was quite a critical insight into the way that you'd approach the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's not just the book, it's my whole writing career. I'm really fascinated by where we come from. I didn't start out writing historical books. I started out, my first 3 novels and 1 novella were actually contemporary fiction. But during the course of the novel, I was constantly bringing up backstories, things that had happened to people's parents, things that had happened to people's grandparents, and how that had a bearing on these individual characters and why they behaved in the way that they did. And so it really became a kind of passion for me of where do we come from? And then I was just constantly finding myself drawn towards these 2 particular periods. And 1820 to 1845 is really interesting because it's sort of late Georgian, early Victorian, and this is the point where there is a British Empire, but it really begins to take off, and you have all these interesting developments in the railways and in photography and all kinds of sort of I suppose tech start to happen, and they
also just urban growth. I mean, that's a
huge. I mean,
phenomenal period is for people moving from rural areas into the cities, and
exactly because there were factories and jobs and all this sort of stuff. So these 2 things were very much tied together. It was a time of huge upheaval, but it's also the point at which the empire begins to really, really grow. So you see this huge kind of change in society and in this sense of where you come from and who you are because of the British Empire. And then the 50s is where that begins to tail off. So you get, the British handing back Palestine, partitioning India, doing all kinds of stuff in the late 40s and into the 50s. And this is where this begins to sort of diminish almost. And I think that's why I'm so fascinated by these 2 eras, is that they bookend this identity. It's about where we come from. And that's something that we're still fascinated with and fascinated by, and in a sense also still suffering from, because it's the thing at the heart, or one of the things at the very heart of the Brexit debate. So for me, all historical fiction is really about the present. When you're writing about the past, you're writing about where we come from and making those connections to where we come from so that we can understand ourselves better, because until you know where you come from, you can't understand where you're going. So,
but also within that Orwell quote, there's a notion of power, isn't there? And as I say, you highlight it by emphasizing the he at the end of it, so it's sort of gendered power as well as actually class power or national power. And how do you see then this set of relationships about controlling the past and the present controlling the past and the past controlling the future? How do you see it in relation to the built environment, to monuments, and also to the more intangible environment around street names and things like that?
I think writing the book radicalized me. I was always an equality activist. I've always been interested and kind of and made the case for equality, not just gender equality, but all different kinds of equality as well, because our history is tremendously heteronormative. It's tremendously white, and it is tremendously male. So I think in the book I quote Bettany Hughes, a female historian who most people have seen her on television, and she undertook a study in 2016, I think, and came up with a figure of, of our written history, our official history, really only 0.5% of it is female, and that's an absolutely shocking kind of statistic to see as a woman. And I think even when I started the book, I knew there were some amazing female stories, and I was given by the publisher an absolutely clean slate. He said, if you want to write about 50 women, do. If you want to write about 25 women, do, just put up monuments to those women and write about those women in detail. And when I started to sort of sketch out what I wanted to do and look at the kind of scope of it, I thought, no, I can't do that, because there are so many stories untold. And one of the big points I wanted to make for people reading the book was that we are not short of amazing grandmothers and great-grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers. There's lots and lots and lots of them. We just don't tell those stories. And we still do it. We still do that. So about 2 years ago, actually at the time I was writing the book, was the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and they had all kinds of coverage on TV and on radio, and lots of politicians on chatting about it. And it was kind of into the afternoon when there was a phone call taken, I think, on a BBC programme, which was the son-in-law, I think, of Mo Mowlam. And Mo Mowlam, of course, was the architect of the Good Friday Agreement, the person who pushed it through, the most important politician who was involved. She was the Northern Ireland Secretary. And nobody had mentioned Mo Mowlam. They'd had on Tony Blair, they'd had on Gordon Brown, they'd had on all these guys talking about how important it was, and no one had said her name. And we have this like curiously, culturally ingrained short memory for the achievements of women. And so when I started to write, the book was originally commissioned to 55,000 words. And I would phone up the publishing office and I'd say, find a few more women. Could I get a few more words? And I said, how many would you like? And I said, 5,000. Of the 5,000 would be great. And the book that you have there is like over 80,000 words long and contains the memory of 1,200 women. And you know what? I'm still running a list on my Dropbox of women that I could still put in. You know, I'm still finding stories. I'm still hearing stories and thinking, I'll just put her on the list. And we have a paperback coming out next year now. It was supposed to come out this year, but it's now going to come out next year. And I phoned up and I said, can I get another 5,000 words? But they were wise to me. They were like, oh, she's going to start this again. So they said, you can't have any more words except what you can fit in at the end of chapters. So if at the end of the chapter, there's a half page of blank space, you can put in another one or two monuments to women there. So I managed to shoehorn in, I think, another 10 women into the book by that means. But I have more. I have at least another 20 or 30 that I would really like to put monuments to, or create imaginary monuments to, on my Dropbox list. And that feeling of plenty, you know, that feeling of, it's not just one woman who was forgotten. It's not a one-off. This is something that we have done to our families, you know, because it's not, you know, this isn't a gendered issue in the sense that, you know, the ladies that we're leaving out are your grandma as well as a man. So it's not just an issue for women. It's about remembering who we are and where we really come from, no matter what your gender is. So
there's these hundreds of women in Scotland, and I can't remember, I don't know how many there are in your Edinburgh chapters of it, but should we say dozens at least, maybe, I don't know. But how many monuments are there then in Edinburgh to women?
Well, there's two to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria loved a statue. She is the most commemorated woman in the UK. And on top of that has, you know, stuff named after her all over the place: Victoria Chambers, Victoria Street, Victoria Road, Victoria everything. So we have a statue to Victoria at the bottom of Leith Walk, and we have a statue to Victoria on top of the gallery at the bottom of the mound. We have a statue to Mary Queen of Scots, one on the Scott Monument and one on the National Portrait Gallery on Queen Street. She's a little one because they're not huge statues on the facade there. And we have a statue to Helen Crummy at Craigmillar, which I think you were talking about earlier that week. And that statue-wise, that's kind of it. And we do have another couple of memorials, and we have some streets that are named after women as well, but we're not doing very well.
So it's 5. And
to named women. There are other women knocking about who are justice or peace, or that are, for example, the Gladstone Monument in Coates Crescent has got a lot of Greek writing on it, and some cherubs and some sort of half-dressed Greek ladies, one of whom is justice, one of whom is peace, I think. And there's quite a few women on that statue. They're female figures, but they're not named women. They're not women who actually did anything. They are figurative. And the other thing, that's not always bad. Sometimes that's good. So we have, for example, the statue on Lothian Road outside the Sheraton, which is the first statue in the UK to show a black woman. And that's a great statue, something I think the city should be really proud of having. But she's still not a real woman. She's just a figurative woman and child. On that statue. So yeah, not enough is the answer. And one of the things, I mean, during the course of writing this book, I became quite radicalized because, I sort of knew we had no statues to women, and then you start wandering around thinking, where did I put this? And where you start taking down the statues to men, you're like, hang on a minute, there's hundreds of them. You're seeing some of these guys that have got statues and you're like, you do not deserve a statue. Walking furious, absolutely furious along George Street, thinking, and who were you and why are you up anyway? And then they put up the statue to James, I've slightly got that the wrong way around, James Clerk Maxwell? Yes. At the east end of George Street, they put up a statue in the last kind of 3 or 4 years to him. And amazing achievement. He definitely deserves a statue, but he's there with his dog, not his wife, who did a lot of his calculations. And that's just absolutely infuriating. You're just like, what were you thinking when you commissioned this statue, for heaven's sake? She, it's a real life woman and she really contributed. And there he is sitting on his chair with his dog. So it's pretty annoying once you start noticing it. And when the book came out, which was last year, I did a lot of book festivals over the summer and went all over Scotland speaking at book festivals. And discovered that this wasn't just something that happened to me. There were a number of people who had bought the book, read the book, came along, and they were like, it's so infuriating. I'm so angry. I walked down here, I saw this thing, and I realized that why wasn't that a woman? And I'm like, yeah, join the club. You can't unsee it. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So it's very frustrating.
So you mentioned the dog. Am I right in thinking there are more statues to animals than to women?
Yes. There's Bum the dog. At the one of the west gates of Princes Street. There's Greyfriars Bobby. There's James Clerk Maxwell's dog. In Princes Street Gardens alone, there is an elephant, a bear. There's loads of horses. Wellington's horse outside Register House at the East End. So yeah, we have a lot of named animals, many more named animals than named women. It's pretty annoying.
So if we take the Orwell quote, that the pecking order is men, animals, women.
Yeah, it looks like it in Edinburgh at the moment, though. I do hope that the book will instigate change. It's kind of written as a provocation. And there are signs of that happening, with something that's happening in the much wider world as well. But I think one of the things that the book has provided is a pool of women you could commemorate. It's a very easy to see, because I did quite a lot of work to put the memorials to the women that I put up in the places where they lived or where they worked, so that they are appropriate. We have had in the office here a couple of councils get in touch and say, we're really interested, could we not make exactly the monuments necessarily that I have made, but that they could have a look at commemorating some of these women, because they're in the place that they ought to be. And so that's really satisfying to make that easier for councils, because most of these monuments are actually city council or regional council controlled.
So some of the people watching tonight may not have read the book, so I wondered, just to give them a flavour of how you've done this sort of imaginary casting of Scotland. Would you like to lead us on a walk from Destiny Station along to the West End, along Princesses Street?
In my head, oh gosh, I'm not sure if I can do that. I suppose I can talk about some of the women that I commemorated. Destiny Station, because Waverley Station is the only station in the world named after a novel, and it's Sir Walter Scott's novel, I decided to name it after Susan Ferrier's novel, Destiny, which came out, I'm going to say, I think it's in the very late 18-teens or early 1820s. And Susan Ferrier, who was the youngest of the Ferrier sisters, who lived on George Street for a while and then moved to Albany Street, she wrote this book anonymously. She was very shy about being named, and people love this book. It's a great novel. I think in some ways quite a contrast to Jane Austen, and it contrasts favourably in some respects with Jane Austen, as does the other great Edinburgh writer Mary Brunton's work. And when Destiny came out, people thought it was Walter Scott. And Walter Scott said, no, 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 this is a writer who's much more talented than I am. So Sir Walter was not necessarily wrong there. So I named Waverley Station Destiny Station after Susan Ferrier's book. And then I created, instead of the Scott Monument, I created the Ferrier Arch, which is, instead of the Scott Monument being at the east end of Princes Street, we put up this triumphal arch, like the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And it, like the Scott Monument, has all sorts of little figures on it. And one of the little figures is Sir Walter Scott, because he supported Susan Ferrier in her career. And then walking through the gardens, I used some monuments that are there already. For example, the Ross Fountain, which is at the west end of the gardens, has recently been renovated. I created into a fountain to commemorate Muriel Spark. And I also created a statue of a woman dipping her hand into the fountain, who was the teacher that Miss Jean Brodie was based on in Spark's novel. So the teacher at Gillespie's that taught Muriel Spark. And of course, I renamed Princess Street after which is named for the sons of George III, into Princess Street for his daughters, because he also had a number of daughters. And so it was that kind of creating an imaginary world for places that are memorialised, and some things that you just don't realise you say. Like, for example, Fife became a queendom instead of a kingdom in the book, or Arthur's Seat. I mean, we don't really think of Arthur's Seat commemorating Arthur, but I made it into St. Triduana's Seat, who's a female saint. So quite often I think these things are so deep in our kind of acceptance, we just accept them, and you suddenly think, well, actually, why is that male? Why do we have an old man of Hoy and not an old lady of Hoy, old woman of Hoy? Why is the National Monument in Stirling a Highlander, a Highland warrior? Why isn't it a woman? Because any of the women, or all of the women who worked in the Scottish Women's Hospitals during World War I actually contributed a huge amount to our nation. And they are pretty much unrecognised. So it was a mixture of picking these sort of groups of women, individual women, and also mythical women. So I put up some monuments to things like Selkies, or to the Cailleach, the Hag of Spring. So it's pretty wide-ranging, but then the way men are commemorated is very wide-ranging as well. So I wanted to kind of create a mirror world where you could walk through, and everything, instead of 90-something% of our statues and street names and benches and bells and just our general assumptions being male, what would happen if they were female? That was the idea of it.
I'm conscious that on social media, some of the trailing for tonight's event mentioned the Edinburgh Seven. So I think I've got to ask you to say who they were, otherwise some people might ask for their money back.
Well, Sophia Blake was really amazing. I'm very, very connected to Edinburgh. I mean, some of these women went on, they finished the degree, but they didn't graduate, because you couldn't graduate as a woman, you had to go abroad to graduate. So these 7 women, who were a group that was sort of curated, if you like, by Sophia Jex Blake, were real kind of pioneers in going in and studying, being the first group of women to study medicine. And we forget how controversial this was. I mean, it caused a riot, an actual literal riot, where people were letting sheep free about the place and throwing missiles up and down Newington Road. I mean, it just sounds crazy. These women were sitting an exam, and the male students were very unhappy about that. And in fact, quite whipped up by, among other people, Joseph Lister, who of course is a huge hero, but was a bit misogynist as well. So so Sophia Jex Blake then went on to graduate. She went abroad to gain her degree and became a doctor. She was key in setting up the Women's Hospital in London, came back to Edinburgh, lived in the West End, not far from where I'm sitting now on Manor Place, and also had a house at Bruntsfield. And she donated her house at Bruntsfield to become a very early women and children's hospital, which basically was kind of a maternity hospital, really. Dealing with gynecological problems and sick babies. So it always astonishes me that someone who gave the city so much, who dedicated so much in our city, is not entirely uncommemorated, but had that been a man, had that been an early doctor who gave his house to become a hospital, I'm pretty sure we'd have a statue of that guy. So yeah, Sophia Jex-Blake is a kind of personal heroine of mine, and I walk past her house on Manor Place almost every day. And there is a brass plaque now outside, but I think it has been put up by the people who live in the house. It's not been put up by an institution. It doesn't really say an awful lot about her, and I think her story is actually extremely inspiring. And certainly that later generation who went on to become, you know, the sort of main core of the suffragettes, these are the daughters of these early doctors who are the first women to get degrees. And that generation then spawned a group of women who actually, many of whom were extremely militant and highly educated. So you get Elsie Ingalls, who goes on to establish the Scottish Women's Hospitals during World War One.
That's great, thanks. One thing that emerges, I think, from the Edinburgh section of the book anyway, is because the figures are largely historical, and Edinburgh, you know, up until 1920 is not much more than the city centre and the kind of inner bit that we've got now. The story and your map and the tour you take us on is really about the city centre. And I just wonder, you know, are there stories that potentially could be found in the suburbs, which in those days, I guess, would just have been, you know, farm fields and dairies and so on, but, you know, have been inhabited since like the 1920s. So there's, you know, a generation, more than one generation gone through there since then. Are there things out there that you might look at, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, some women I brought into the city centre because it was quite important because the book is an imagined guidebook. So to start taking people way out, somewhere out of town was a bit tricky. I think I did it for Jackie Crookston, who led the anti-militia march and was killed. Again, that's a sort of late Georgian working class heroine. And there is a monument to her in Musselburgh. So I think I included that monument because in the book I did include existing monuments, as well as making most of them up, but when there was something there I certainly did that. But about their only rule, and they were very good with me, they said, oh, you can write as many different women as you like, just make the guidebook great, and you know, you can have as many extra pages as you like for a long time, until finally when I got to my 80,000 mark they said, we have to go to the printers now, will you please stop adding women. Was that they had to be dead. And so that means that actually when, you know, yeah, okay, people who are living in Edinburgh in the 1920s, yeah, they're probably dead. But actually, one of the women that I included in the paperback version only died last year. And she's a woman called Polly Higgins, who is from outside Glasgow and actually died, I think, somewhere near London. And she was a lawyer who formed an environmental action group to create the environment as a legal entity so that the environment could be protected. And I knew Polly, I had met her a few times, and she was really a very impressive person. When she died, I thought, yeah, I want to put up a monument to her. So the minute someone's dead, you can get them in. But of course, then there are some very long-lived people who have achieved a very great deal, but those rules were the rules. So I figured I had to stick to that one at least.
So you've got to be dead to be commemorated, yeah? Yeah,
well, the book was commissioned by Historic Environment Scotland. Yeah. It was pretty much their only rule. So it's like, okay, then we'll do that. But I mean, one of the most amazing things actually was finding women. So I trailed or researched obituaries. So I looked through obituaries, hundreds of obituaries in the Scotsman and the Herald, and also in the Times and the Telegraph, looking for Scottish women, and particularly in the last sort of 20 years, where that memory is very easy to lose. You know, that's the point where it gets lost actually. Quite often. So yeah, it was great to be able to include some of those names, like Frankie Raffles, who was a Jewish photographer who lived in Edinburgh, and she shot the Zero Tolerance campaign, which is a massive sort of landmark campaign in the 80s. And so being able to include Frankie was a great thing to be able to do, among lots of other women who had been alive more recently, if you like.
We're very conscious that at the moment the issues of statues, memorials, monuments can be quite controversial, and even going back, you mentioned the South African one in Sheridan, which, you know, from my recollection, I've not checked this out, but my recollection was that when that was commissioned, it was controversial as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was quite cutting edge. And actually, during Black Lives Matter, I occasionally post a thread on Twitter of, 6, 8, 10 women who, whatever it is, doesn't matter what it is. So 10 women who, were early doctors, or 10 women who wrote books, or, and I do these threads that are just like information threads. And for Black Lives Matter, I did a thread of Black women in Scotland, and I posted about this statue, and I got a number of people who came back on that thread and said, oh, it's outside the Sheraton won't be glad. And I was like, the Sheraton should be proud, but the perception still, I think, is with many of these things that for some people, they just find it difficult to accept that it's not male, pale and stale.
And so within that context, can you see ways that here in Edinburgh, the balance could be redressed? Would something like a citizens' assembly on placing statues or on renaming streets, would that have any mileage, do you think?
There is some work going on in the City Council here where they have new streets, and they want to name new streets after women. They specifically ask for women, and you find, I think along Abbey Hill, there are a couple of streets along there that have been named after landmark women. But I think part of the issue is that the prestige is in the city centre around George Street and Princes Street and all the statues that are around there. And I think my own view is, and I know I vary from other people about this, but I think we need to remove some of these statues and cite them elsewhere in order to make space to tell our history the way our history really was. And we have the great benefit of hindsight. And we can see that sometimes people have put up statues that maybe shouldn't be there now, or that don't reflect a true, because a statue is an honour. Make no mistake, a statue isn't a history book. It's about honouring a certain individual, and we do have to individuals who perhaps shouldn't be honoured, and not that they shouldn't be remembered, and not that we shouldn't remember our part in that. And my view is that some of these need to be removed, and that we should be looking to replace them. But there are, I understand it's a huge administrative issue, particularly with street names. If you have 500 people who live in addresses on a particular street and you change that street name, that's quite a big task for all of those people to be involved in, to bring all of those people on board. So I think it's something that happens occasionally. Dundas Street, it's a good example. Dundas Street in Edinburgh was originally Pitt Street. There was a whole section of that was called Pitt Street. And then when Edinburgh and Leith merged city councils, they decided they couldn't have 2 Pitt Streets in Edinburgh. So they renamed that section of Dundas Street to be Dundas Street. Now, I'm not a big fan of Dundas, so I'm not sure that was the greatest idea, but it shows it can be done. You can decide to do it. And I think we need to be very mindful that we have some, really world-class women, and women who have made amazing achievements, and we shouldn't be sticking them up the back just because there's no room anymore. You have to make room. And that's my view on it.
Yeah, just on street names, I spent quite a lot of time doing work in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe. And of course, after 1989, street names changed there almost overnight. So these things do happen some places. It's a particular time, particular place. But
they took the statues down there as well. In Eastern Europe, they took the statues down, and they created like these statue parks of horror, where they put all these communist statues, and it's now a tourist attraction. You can go and see the communist statue park, if you like, but it's out of the centre of town. It's in a specific place. It's a museum where the issues around those statues and why they were put up and why it was appropriate in the view of that society for those statues to come down, and you can have that discussion within the context of that kind of park, if you like.
Yeah, there's one in Latvia where you can be shouted at by guards in Soviet uniforms with aggressive Alsatian dogs. After the experience,
I think that's great. I think that's really important. You know, that we could have men hanging about.
They dress you out in the fashions, you know, the fashions of the day from USSR.
I mean, it's about experiencing that, isn't it? It's about making our history real, and then you understand your grandmother. And I mean, as a novelist, I do this when I create characters. So, for example, this is a book I will be writing next year, but there is a character in it in the early 1800s. His great grandmother was burned as a witch. And that has affected her whole family and the way that she will stand up to things, or her sense of herself, her sense of her value. You know, this is where we come from, and the past remains live with us for generations. And that's
this links back to Andrew last night as well. I mean, I can remember one of the Craig Miller musicals was about one of the women that you talk about that mentioned the witch. Remind me, it was Half Hang It Maggie.
Yes.
They did the musical around that, and again it was part of finding out who were your grandmothers and great grandmothers, etc. I'm conscious of the time, so I want to put one last question to you, and then we'll hand back to Terry to see what questions the other people have come up with. But if you could find one site in Edinburgh to put up one monument to one woman, what would be the site and who would be the woman?
It's controversial. I'm going to take down Dundas. Of course I am. In St Andrew's Square. That's certainly one that I feel could come down. I mean, you could equally at the other end take down Albert on his horse in Charlotte Square. But I'd be taking down Dundas and St Andrew's Square. And if I had to put up one woman, do you know, what I feel about that particular site is that was the headquarters on St Andrew's Square of the Scottish Women's Hospital. So actually, I think potentially an Elsie Ingalls, or even just a monument to the sacrifice of the women who ran the hospitals, you know, what they did. Because these women, when they died, if they died, they were not put on the war memorials. World War I women, very, very rarely, very occasionally you do see one, but largely. So you'll have a family where the sons went off to fight and a couple of the sons died and the daughters went off to nurse and one of the daughters died. And it's only very often you only see the sons on the war memorial. And that just seems to me inherently wrong, you know, if you are memorializing sacrifice. And so I suppose if I was putting up a statue instead of Melville because of St Andrew's Square and because of its history and its association with the Scottish Women's Hospital, many of those women as well were suffragettes, but that's where the headquarters was. It was in the building on the corner, which is now Tiles Bar. And so I suppose that's perhaps what I would put there, I think.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks very much. And back to Terry to see what the wider audience is wanting to know.
Well, thank you very much. This is, I think, one instance when I will be defeated by trying to get through all of the questions and all of the kind of issues here. So I do apologize at the very outset. And in the chat function, there's been some really interesting kind of dialogue about things. So we'll capture that as well, and that can stand kind of on its own. But one question that's come in has been in connection with the Ladies' Emancipation Society, which has featured in a number of the talks that we've actually had over this kind of week. I was wondering if in your mind, in your kind of tour, where they would sit in your hierarchy or prioritization of commemoration.
These are suffragists, aren't they? They're not suffragettes, am I right?
Well, the way how it was kind of certainly kind of put to us is that they made the decision to concentrate on the emancipation issue before dealing with the suffragette issue, which was very distinct from America, where they started off as suffragettes and then moved into the emancipation movement. So it was a very, very noble kind of approach, that is, let's solve this apparent kind of problem, and then we'll get on to dealing with our own kind of problem.
It's almost like they made a mistake, that sounds like then, doesn't it? It feels to me like they made a mistake in terms of going down in history, but then if it was a male movement, it would definitely be commemorated. But if you had a group of guys who formed a group, you definitely would have commemoration to them. I think the suffragettes have such great stories. It's difficult to get past them in terms of commemorating that generation, because they are just so extraordinary and they do such outrageous things, and that totally captures the public imagination. And there are a number of men, again, who have statues erected to them, probably, and for exactly the same reason. Their story was great. So David Livingstone, who has a statue in East Princes Street Gardens, and also a statue actually in George Square in Glasgow. Great story. Terrible, terrible missionary. You know, he went to Africa to be a missionary, and he converted one guy the whole time that he was there. You know, he dragged his wife and children around Africa. Many of the children, I think all the children, actually died while they were there, because, you know, they shouldn't really have been dragged around Africa. You know, it's a terribly dangerous thing to do. And I just think, why are there two huge statues in these sort of key positions to this man? You know, it just seems like it's an interesting story. And I think in a sense you get that with the suffragettes, but because they were successful, it's like that's going to be the key women of that generation. So I'm not saying you can't memorialize other women who were part of the suffragist movement, and also women who, you know, there were quite a few interesting women's movements. The women who were part of the suffrage movement all went on. In Glasgow, many of them went into the Labour movement. You know, they started out as suffragettes and they moved on. So you get like Rose Glasgow Kerrigan, who was communist actually, and she was a suffragette and went on to be part of various labour organisations as well. All the women who were part of the Glasgow rent strike, many of them were suffragettes, some of them were suffragists. So yeah, I think you need to commemorate it in the round, but I think the nature of people is that the suffragettes have the best stories, I suppose. And that's kind of how commemoration works. You know, we remember the best stories. These are the stories we tell about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. As a largely historical kind of novelist, I'll try and blend some questions together.
Yeah.
First of all, one is, are you working up a kind of a novel where the women will feature on the cover of the book? But there's a question about the histories written by the victors and the ethics of writing about historical figures as you do so. Do you have any kind of thoughts about how you approach that?
Well, first of all, yes, I am. I've just finished writing actually a book for next year, which is called The Fair Botanists, which is set in Edinburgh in 1882. So well spotted, I am onto this. And the next book I'll be writing is also very Scotland based as well. It's more based in Glasgow actually. But the book I've been writing this year, The Fair Botanists, is about the move of the botanics from Leith Walk to Inverleith. In the 1820s, early 1820s, and has lots of real life figures in it. Sir Walter Scott among them, and William McNabb, who was the head gardener at the Botanics at that time, and some famous women in that age, including Henrietta Liston, who was one of the preeminent botanists of the age, who had just come back from various travels to Edinburgh. And it's a romp. It's a great fun, this book. It's the story of a flower that's flowering, and everyone wants this flower and its seeds. And a lot of women get involved in this sort of intrigue. And I won't say any more about it than that, because it hasn't actually been announced. It'll be out next May, and I have to start editing it on Monday.
Oh, right. Okay. So it's a job for you here.
Yeah. So that has been the best fun for me, because quite often I'll write a book set in, Brazil or in China or in, on the Arabian Peninsula or in Brighton or something. It's been really nice for me to bring my story home, and actually it went very, very smoothly because I know Edinburgh very well, and so I found I wasn't having to sort of constantly go back to maps, because I know what was there. But I did discover lots of exciting things that I didn't know about Edinburgh. Like there was a huge distillery down at Tanfield, near Tanfield at the bottom of Dundas Street for a long time. It was founded by the Hagues. And was a Hague distillery, so that was great fun. to do, and I am planning to write a couple more books set in Scotland now, because it was such a great experience for me. And of course it speaks to where I come from very much. You know, my family's been in Edinburgh for a while, so yeah, that seemed to me something that was important to do. Your question though was the second part of that question was about something else, wasn't it? Tell me again.
It's about the ethics in
Oh, yeah.
kind of writing about historical figures and that.
So sure. I think every novelist takes a different view on this, and I actually had a big chat about this very issue about 2 weeks ago with a PhD student who's writing a whole PhD about it, because it's a thing. I never use real life figures as characters that I manipulate. So I might mention people, but I don't use them as characters that I then send off to do things in my 1950s books, because I would consider that too close. But I have less scruples about doing that further back in time, because everyone who knows that world, everyone who knew those people are dead. And even if you're related, you know, if you're talking about a character that's knocking around in 1820, it's 200 years ago, you're quite a lot of foremothers ago before you get back to that person. So I have used Sir Walter Scott, and I've actually done something a bit naughty with Robert Burns, who's dead at that point, but with the memory of Robert Burns, but very much in the spirit of the way that Burns was. You know, Burns had a number of illegitimate children, and I created an illegitimate son who is fictional. But that situation could have been possible. So I think what I do is I try and write into the gaps. So quite often you'll get historical figures who disappear for a few months because they're just not recorded during those few months. And I think, that's when this adventure will happen. Mm-hmm. And you bring them in and bring them out and try and be true to the stuff that they really did do wherever you can, you know. And that's my view on it. But some historical novelists take a totally different view. In both directions. Some people won't write anything that they think that didn't happen. And I think it's one of the big problems actually, that when journalists and academics think, oh, I'll write a historical novel, they then drive themselves completely mad, because they're not used to being able to make anything up. And it is a novel, and you do, in order to create a comprehensive lie, which is the world of the novel, you have to be prepared to sort of make things up. So, and I think actually when I was writing Where Are the Women, the Imagine guidebook, somebody said to the publisher, shouldn't an academic be doing that? And we just laughed, because that would drive an academic absolutely mad, because none of these monuments actually exist. It was kind of only the job that a kind of historical nerd who was really interested in all the real stuff, but actually had less scruples about manipulating it. So the stories are real and Scotland is real, but very few of the monuments in the book actually exist.
But been made all the more powerful as a result of that as well. And we've been talking this week and we've been experiencing kind of over a period of recent kind of time, major events around and reflections around slavery, around Black lives and ethnic kind of issues around kind of women, as you've been talking about kind of in here. What's your feeling that debates around history are less around a continuous progress of historical thought, but more about ruptures or recurrence or challenge? And if that's the case, then how would you go about harnessing those kind of powers to bring change forward, particularly I think as we're thinking in the context here in a physical sense in a place like Edinburgh?
I think the physical stuff is so important. I mean, I have friends with some novelists who are a bit more famous than I am. One of them said to me the other week, what can I do? I have all these best-selling novels, and I can see that, you have discovered all these best-selling novelists who just disappeared. Dorothy Stevenson, younger cousin, second cousin, I think, of Robert Louis Stevenson, sold a lot more books than he did in her time, and we all remember Robert Louis, and nobody remembers D.E. Stevenson lived in one of the crescents at the West End and then moved down to the borders. I think there's some of her artifacts in a museum in Muffet. And I said to my friend, you need to build a building. It's the only way to do it is to endow a library or a school or something, and you will then be remembered. And so the built environment is really, really important way to do this. And it's quite interesting because we have a number of Victorian heiresses in Scotland. You have to remember that women, Scots law was different. So the best example of this actually is pre-Victorian, when all the after Culloden, everyone was arrested. All the Jacobites were arrested. And they arrested everyone. They arrested women who ran supply lines and hid fleeing Jacobite warriors and all kinds of stuff. And everyone was up in court, and the jails across the country, across the whole of Britain, were absolutely stowed out with Jacobites. And these women were coming up in court. Some of the Scottish women were coming up in court in England, and they were paying their own fines. And this absolutely shocked English women. They couldn't believe it, because English women couldn't own property. English women were property. And that difference in Scots law was really important. And so 1847 is the first call we have for women MPs in Parliament. And it was a call which was, absolutely derided. It took over 100 years for that to actually happen. But it was a group of noble, quite posh, very well-to-do English women who saw these Scottish women paying their own fines and thought, bloody hell, I want that. And that's what it's about. It's about seeing what you can have. And the built environment is very important in this, because if you were walking along George Street and you were a teenager growing up in Edinburgh, as I myself was, and you see a number of, 15, 20 foot high, big bronze men, you do not believe that your achievements will ever be important, because you do not see yourself. You think you're going to have to be the first. You're going to have to be the first female scientist, or the first writer, or the first whatever it is. And it's the same if you're from a minority. In fact, it's double trouble if you're a black woman or a Jewish woman. I'm a Jewish woman. There are no statues to Jewish women. If you don't see it, you don't realize you can be it. And that's really, really important, because white men walk around in that world the whole time, where it's normal. It seems normal for them to achieve. And if you're a kid wandering around and you walk down George Street and there's a girl on one side of the street and a boy on the other side of the street, the boy sees every single time he gets to a corner that his achievements might be worth a statue, and the girl never gets to see that. And that's why it's important. Fantastic.
Great. We're coming really, and it used to be the clock on the back of your wall. I can see better than the one for me. And I've got one question, and this is mine, because so apologies for everybody for that. But if you found in the rewrite of your novel going into a paperback an extra half page that you hadn't kind of noticed before, of these 20 women who aren't going to feature with a little bit, which one would you pick out to get her into the book?
I don't know if I'm going to manage to do this, actually, because I had a late begging session with one of the editors, and I can't believe I missed this story, and I feel guilty and awful in the 8-month whirlwind that was writing this book that I missed it. But in the 17th century, there was a court case of a young Scottish girl who was sold by her mother to a traveling circus, and she became an acrobat, and she ran away from the circus, and the circus owner pursued her and took her to court to have her person. He wanted her back. In other words, he said, I bought you and you're mine, and you have to come and perform in my circus. And there was a landmark judgment which said, no, we don't do that in Scotland. Parents can't sell their children. We don't do that kind of thing. And it's and you cannot be owned. So it's a kind of very early anti-slavery ruling, really. She's not named. She's very young, and she didn't appear in court, I don't think, herself, or if she did, there's no record of what her name was, but she is known as the Tumbling Lassie. And I found out about her way too late, and I feel awful about it. And I got in touch with them and I said, could we get in the Tumbling Lassie? So I think we're currently trying to do that. So hopefully Excellent. She will appear. But if she doesn't appear, that's the one I pick.
Right. Well, we need a campaign to get the Tumbling Lassie statue up somewhere in all of us.
How could we forget her?
That's absolutely, but there are questions which have gone kind of unanswered, but I'm afraid time is not our friend at the moment. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Cliff to kind of wind things up. But thank you very much for all of those really fascinating answers. Cliff?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. I think it's been a really interesting session, so many insights and such sharp commentary. And thanks to everybody as well who put in the questions, which clearly, as Terry said, unfortunately, there's not been enough time to put all of them. But we do appreciate your involvement with this. And can I also just thank Terry and the team who put it on. I don't know whether we managed ever to get this onto live showing on Facebook. Maybe DJ will tell us about that after. Terry's shaking his head. So we had particular problems tonight with the technology, but we have been recording, so hopefully we will be able to make it available to other people who've not been able to join us tonight. But for those who have, I'm sure everybody's really enjoyed it. And if you could give a virtual round of applause to Sara, that would be very good. So thank you. Back to Terry to wind up.
Well, thank you kind of very much, Cliff. And it's a reminder that tomorrow is obviously the start of Doors Open Days, Edinburgh kind of weekend. And as I said, there's over 70 different kind of venues that you can participate in. And the kind of venues have just pulled out the stops for the effort that they've kind of put in to present their buildings and their stories to kind of all of you. So I really do commend you to go visit our website, cockernassociation.org.uk/Doors Open Days, and just see the experiences that you can actually have, which you can all enjoy from the comfort of your own home over a cup of tea or a bowl of soup, or even tea cakes kind of later on. It's all there for you to kind of explore and do again if you kind of enjoyed tonight's conversation. When the kind of rest of this week's conversations, do think about becoming a member. Do think about giving us a donation. Every penny does help. And with that being said, thank you both very much to our conversationalists tonight, Professor Cliff Hague and Sara Sheridan, for an absolutely stimulating Friday evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And I think herein endeth the conversation.